Good to see you, our atheistic spirits. Welcome to Sessions of Spirit number 29. You might only be caring about the atheistic mode of things on what we're calling the circle of reason, which you will learn more about shortly. But if you are in this mode, I'll do a quick recap of the first 28 sessions, which sounds like a lot, but I'll try and do it in about 2 to 3 minutes, just to give you some background on what you're jumping into. So the first session was about how Hegel sublated over 100 philosophers over 3,000 years of history into one system, his system. The second session was how this concept of one-sidedness prevented people from understanding it for the last 200 years. The third session is that once you understand him, he empowers you to change the world with your practical spirit. Number four is that you get past the stereotypes by getting this first negation understood. The fifth session was about once you understand him, you start at his beginning and you get to the circle of reason. The sixth is that the end of the circle of reason looks religious. Philosophy is the sublation of religion, not just the negation. Because seven, it's a universal logic that we're going to put into analytic notation to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Eight is that you start this universal logic with polemics. To nine, sublate it as genuine refutation. Sublation is just a negation of negation, which sounds unusual right now, but you'll learn it. It'll make sense eventually. 10 is a masterclass in this stuff. That's called the science of logic that Hegel gives us. 11th is that the science of logic is truly incredible. It is this world that's ineffable, that's speaking itself. The 12th session is that the point of life is this living version of logic. The 13th session is that we got to liberate everybody with it. The 14th session is about connecting to God through this living logic. But 15 is that you can be atheistic in connecting to your inner child in a profound way or your higher self. The 16th session is that our gurus were just doing this implicitly as the science. 17 is that we're sublating old mysticism with the real scientific power of now to get to true mysticism. 18th is that the limit of our reason is the limit of our fun. We have to flow. And 19 is that a real polemic, a real good philosopher uses laughter. The 20th is that an ideal philosopher uses this capacity to synchronize all these philosophies and sublate them all at once. 21 is that this is how you overcome ignorance by sublating one-sidedness through the wisdom quiz and the synchronicity document of philosophies. 22 is that we are lacking wisdom in the world around our disruptive technologies like CRISPR because we don't have this universal logic. 23 is that we have to make this more concrete and understandable to speed up our practical spirit using these documents like the synchronicity document. 24 is that we want to supercharge our interpersonal communication like Plato and Socrates. And 25 is that a couple of particular examples of how to do this is we have to sublate particular religions in our current epoch. And 26 is to do the opposite, to sublate with existentialists in the same way. And then 27th is to also harmonize and idealize capitalism, socialism, communism as the kind of community versions of these modes of being together. So 28 is, we did that with Buddhism as well, to overcome this existential crisis feeling we have and still have meaning. So 29 today is called Absolute Atheism. And SOS stands for Sessions of Spirit, but also Save Our Souls. And as an atheist, man, I like that. It's just a sort of turn of phrase to say that we need to apply philosophy practically because wisdom is about making the world better. And atheists can be good, right? You don't need God to be good, is the saying that we as atheists use to say that you can have practical wisdom and still do good things without an explicit God. So the summary paragraph today is a couple of paragraphs, a little long, but I'll go through it anyway. So it goes like this. Is there any paradigm which could unite all atheists? Is there a paradigm of knowledge which could not only unite all atheists, but all atheists with all philosophers of every kind, including religious philosophers? A new discovery seems to suggest yes. There is a philosopher who wrote a genuinely philosophical system which achieves what atheism hopes to represent. That philosopher is Hegel. But isn't Hegel a self-declared Christian? Yes, but a new reading of him has uncovered a surprising insight. Hegel doesn't just stop at Christianity or religion in general. He performs a logical move called sublation. This means the final and highest mode of genuine and true scientific knowledge is the fulfillment of what art and religion were trying to capture in their sensuous representations. Philosophy grasps this content in its pure mode as universal knowledge, infinitely scientific knowledge, of which atheists of all types and creeds universally declare as the best mode of objective knowledge in modern practice. To Hegel, however, it seems atheists are not atheistic enough. Hegel becomes more atheist than an atheist by showing incredibly that if atheists universally deny discovery by revelation, that the other alternative is pure logic. But a true atheist must have a logic which is itself self-grounding. If a system of logic does not ground itself, then it means there is a presupposition that is given outside it. This unjustified ground, ironically, is revelation. Abstract atheism is therefore committing the same mistake that it condemns of religion. Hegel states that a concrete atheist develops a logic which is its own ground. It circles back through the power of genuine reason to have its beginning also as its end. All true science must have this form to be truly presuppositionless. Oddly, this complete system of circularity forms an absolute. It is the only God concrete atheists can believe in. It is the content of religion in its pure rationality, pure supersensuous universal form, logic in the element of which truth has its essence. If atheism is not to be a religion, it must have this absolute as its core. It is a profound contradiction that Hegel brilliantly resolves in genuine philosophy. A little bit unusual, but I hope that it triggers a couple of principles of atheism that feels like its essence, but it's canceling something that seems to be contradictory in extreme versions of, or pure versions of, the mode of atheism, the philosophy of atheism. Let's go to the notes and unpack this a little bit. So the last time we ended off on Buddhism in the last session. And we spoke about, Buddhism being close to an atheistic religion because it was supposed to be a God that is no God. Buddha didn't want people to worship him. He wanted people to do it for themselves, be self-determining, like the existentialists. But we want to now try and make a sublation without any religion, any sensuousness at all, pure straight atheism. So did Hegel really have an atheistic moment in the circle of reason when he declares himself to be a Christian? So if you're new to the sessions, you can handle contradictions in your thought. A really great philosopher can handle opposing positions without succumbing to them. And they can hold this contradiction in their mind, but also resolve it through a right ordering of things, a right ordering of concepts. And when you do it properly, you can find it on this conceptual circle where everything is connected to everything else logically. There's this universal logic. So does Hegel really include atheism here when he's saying he's a Christian and all this kind of stuff? Well, there are atheists that read Hegel and say he's just a pure atheist. And so how do they have this kind of reading? And part of it is hinted at in this first quote that I'm giving from Hegel's youth. And the quote is from a piece he called On the Prospects for a Folk Religion in 1893. So I'll read the whole thing, and the underlined parts are really emphasizing what I think is showing what atheists would like to see, that Hegel is angry and frustrated at religion. He was forced to kind of go into theological school when he was young because his parents maybe couldn't afford high education. They were working class people and they weren't poor by any means, but they thought that the theological school could help, I guess, pay for his schooling, but also give him a good education for his talent. He was recognized as being very talented when he was young. So here's a little quote from his piece. Upon an oppressed spirit, one which, under the burden of its chains, has lost its youthful vigor and begun to age, such religious ideas can have little impact. At the beginning of maturation, the youthful spirit of a people feels its power and exults in its strength. It seizes hungrily upon any novelty, albeit never upon anything that would put fetters on its proud and free neck, and then typically tosses it aside in favor of something else. So he's saying that, yes, the thing he likes is this vigor, this strength, but there's this frivolity to it that it's not really focused or rigorous or committed to anything like the truth. By contrast, now, an aging spirit is characterized by its firm attachment to tradition in every respect. It bears its fetters as an old man endures the gout, grumbling but unable to do more. It lets itself be pushed and shoved at its master's whim, and it is only half conscious when it enjoys itself, not free, open, and bright with the appealing gaiety that invites camaraderie. Moreover, its festivals are but occasions for chatter, since old folk prefer gossip to everything else. Here, there is no boisterousness, no full-blooded enjoyment. This is how we generally feel about religion. If you're atheistic and you're tired of it and you're frustrated, you can clearly identify that Hegel is also frustrated with something in religion, what's going on in this theological school he's at. And he feels oppressed, right? And philosophy, as we covered before, has this life to it. It's supposed to be full-blooded enjoyment, laughter, playfulness, flow. But he's agreeing with atheists in their frustration that there's something that we have to get over here. And whether you're young or old, there's something that's unsatisfactory to a philosopher, a genuine philosopher. So this isn't something that happened later in life and we're cherry picking here. This is happening with Hegel's whole life, young to old. But you might say to yourself, well, this is not really Hegel agreeing with atheists. You know, he's just disagreeing with the type of religion. He's still saying we should have a folk religion or some kind of religion. So it's not satisfactory yet to ourselves as atheists. But I'm giving you another quote here, another paper, another link. And the title is Hegel, the End and Fulfillment of Religion and Theology with Genuine Philosophy. And it's a paper that I wrote to finally resolve once and for all if Hegel leaves the religious mode of consciousness and enters pure atheism, pure something different that's not religious. And my reading of it spans his history of philosophy from about 200 AD to about 1600 AD when Descartes comes on the scene. And he starts with Neoplatonism and works his way through scholasticism and gets his way through the revival of the sciences with Bruno and the proto-scientists who are vehemently trying to break out of scholasticism. And he says real philosophy, this genuine philosophy, starts with Descartes because the I think, therefore I am leaves all sensuousness behind. Descartes cancels all that, right? And so you end up in the realm, a close approximation to, well, in fact, actually pure thought, where it's just you thinking, I think, therefore I am. And I give a pretty good quote here that is often overlooked from his history of philosophy or his lectures on the history of philosophy. And you can read this. I put it a couple of times in the other 38 presentations before this, or the 28. But it's him saying that there is an actual, you can use the word break, but break is too negative, it's too strong. We're not doing an abstract negation here. He's doing a sublation, which does have a qualitative difference. We are transcending. So there is a real separation here, but we're not throwing the baby out the bathwater. There's something in religion we're preserving, but it's not what we might think it is. It's a little surprising. But this quote says, philosophy in its own proper soil separates itself entirely from the philosophizing theology in accordance with its principle, pure thought, and places it on quite another side. So, of course, its own native soil is this kind of non-sensuous realm, super sensuous, you could say, beyond the senses, the five senses that can deceive you. And he says real philosophy starts there. And so here's very clear. He's saying entire separation. We're not just doing a folk religion. He's saying, no, genuine philosophy is not religious consciousness anymore. But it's a sublation. So our religious spirits, if you're hanging with us here, this might feel like an abstract negation, and you might start feeling a pull, right, to negate back. But keep in mind, we've already idealized your truth. This is the atheist truth. This is us as atheists, as well as theists. We're doing a sublation here, which if you're atheist and you're new to these sessions, you might not understand that. But there's a sort of something we preserve, and then something we're canceling, and then we're raised to higher unity. So this quote is showing that we're actually raising to a new thing. We're coming right up the spectrum entirely. But it's not necessarily what we're calling abstract atheism. There's a sort of contradiction that's waiting for us in abstract atheism, incomplete atheism, that in today's society we're not really noticing because we're not speculative philosophers. Ordinary consciousness keeps us in this fragmented way of thinking, and it's creating a lot of turmoil, and it makes it so that religion and science, or religion and atheism, or theism and atheism, can never reconcile. So Hegel, we're finding out, does seem to have this attitude, this atheistic attitude following him. And it doesn't seem to be cherry picked. It seems to be in all his works. And to prove the point even more, it wasn't Nietzsche that said God is dead first. Hegel did. And here's two quotes I'm giving of Hegel saying exactly this. He's saying, the unhappy consciousness, on the other hand, is conversely the tragic fate of the certainty of self that aims to be absolute. It is the consciousness of the loss of all essential being in the certainty of itself, and of the loss even of this knowledge about itself, the loss of substance as well as of the self. It is the grief which expresses itself in the hard saying that God is dead. No uncertain terms here. He's talking about a stage, a moment where you have to go through this in some way or the other to achieve genuine philosophical consciousness. Here's another one. If you think that we're, taking things out of context, he says it again. And he says, the pure concept, however, or infinity, as the abyss of nothingness in which all being sinks, must characterize the infinite pain, which previously was only in culture historically, and as the feeling on which rests modern religion, the feeling that God himself is dead, the feeling which was uttered by Pascal, though only empirically, in his saying, nature is such that it marks everywhere, both in and outside of man, a lost God, purely as a phase, but also as no more than just a phase of the highest idea. Okay, you can say, well, Hegel's not really taking this position. He's just saying that some version of consciousness is going through this, but he's not running away. Like, he's directly facing these atheistic notions. And we can see that it's very discontenting. It's there's something missing, but he's trying to overcome something in religious consciousness, but not necessarily wanting to give into this lifelessness and this despair that when you get rid of a comfortable God, right, a God that's beyond and making everything happen, and there's a kind of comfort there that you don't get in atheism. You don't get when you have a God like that. So the problem here, though, is how do you really define what he's doing? You first have to understand, well, okay, if he's religious or atheistic, we need to know what atheism really is. And so he tries to define or give us an idea of how to think about this. And we can kind of start with pantheism. And back in the 1800s, pantheism was a very bad thing, at least to Christianity. And so pantheism is that God is not really a beyond. It's the world. God is in the world. It is nature. It's everywhere. And you would say, well, this is too much God. Hegel makes a joke. He says, well, now you're angry at people for not having enough God. Now you're angry at people for having too much God. But really the problem with pantheism is that in this other quote here, you can kind of see me getting into it. He's talking about how when you equate God with nature, you're making God finite. And this is what religion really doesn't like, because God is supposed to be infinite, this kind of concrete totality. And so he says, but when the definition in Spinoza is said to identify the world with God and to confound God with nature and the finite world, it is implied that the finite world possesses a genuine actuality and affirmative reality. If this assumption be admitted, of course, a union of God with the world renders God completely finite and degrades him to the bare finite and adventitious congeries of existence. So he's saying this is atheistic, and Spinoza is being accused. He was a Jewish philosopher, but he was excommunicated from the Jewish community because he was saying stuff about this substance that seemed to pervade the whole world and equate God with the universe, with the physical universe, sensuousness. And so they had this really powerful reaction that just doesn't matter who you are. If you don't believe in our God, we're just going to get rid of you. And so Hegel says, well, it looks like he's an atheist, but really he's not really a true atheist. He's more of a cosmist, where he's saying that actually it's not equating God with the world. Spinoza still believes in a God. So it's like, well, is he an atheist? It's more about a definitional problem. He's actually saying that the sensuous world, the finite world, is actually more like an illusion, and that this world that pervades it is the real world. So a cosmism both saying the physical universe is not the real thing. The thing behind it is the substance. But the problem with Spinoza's substance is that it wasn't thinking. It wasn't a subjectivity of personality like Christianity defined God to be. So we're just showing here that atheism seems to be really difficult to pin down. Is pantheism atheism? Is a cosmism a good definition to clarify what we used to think was pantheist, but it's actually theism? And Hegel's kind of outlining again in this quote, the system of Spinoza was not atheism, but a cosmism. So he's clearly saying that, okay, this is not really real atheism. So what is it? We're taking direct quotes here from Hegel so that the scholars in the room know that we're not making this up. Hegel is giving us some good examples of how to think about this. He's got another quote here from the Encyclopedia Logic. And it's kind of giving us a more tricky way. It's even trickier than we think. So he's saying, in order to judge of the greater or less extent to which experience shows cases of atheism or of the belief in God, it is all important to know if the mere general conception of deity suffices, or if a more definite knowledge of God is required. The Christian world would certainly refuse the title of God to the idols of the Hindus and the Chinese, and to the fetishes of the Africans, and even to the gods of Greece themselves, who, of course, Hegel and history holds in high regard. So he's saying in this first part that you might still believe in gods if they're idols, but if it's not the one God, you're an atheist. But now he's saying something opposite in the next part. He's saying, if so, a believer in these idols would not be a believer in God, right? That's the first part. If it were contended, on the other hand, so now he's doing the reversal, that such a belief in idols implies some sort of belief in God, as the species implies the genus, then idolatry would argue not faith in an idol merely, but faith in God. So you can believe in gods, and then it kind of implicitly says you believe in the one God. So it's not really atheistic to believe in the idols now, because it implies their kind of God. But then he says, the Athenians took an opposite view. The poets and philosophers who explained Zeus to be a cloud and maintained that there was only one God were treated as atheists at Athens. So now they're saying that if you believe in a one God and you don't keep them separate as a polytheist God, now you're an atheist again. So whether you believe in the idols or you don't believe in the idols, or you believe in a monotheistic God from the idol gods, you can be framed as an atheist in every case. So it's like he has the whole spectrum covered. And it's like it depends on how you're defining your God that defines whether you're an atheist. And it's kind of a tricky situation. But like hardcore atheists, abstract atheists, let's say, want to just get rid of God entirely. Just get rid of it. And so even in point 5 here, we kind of said that in the existentialist talk a few sessions ago, existentialists kind of started things with nature. And so you could technically say that the God of the existentialist is just nature revealing itself. But let's be super atheistic and say, not even that. Get rid of the whole God thing. Nature's not even God. We're just godless. Stop trying to squeeze in this concept that we don't need and doesn't make life better. This is what we as atheists are frustrated about, because we want to get rid of something very difficult that's following religion. And it's this stickiness. It's this kind of lack of rational thought that's particular and contingent. And it fills things with superstition that's not grounded on any rationality. It could be imagination. And it has been exploited in the past. That's why religion kind of has a bad name, is that they made God a beyond, and we filled it with a bunch of particulars and supersensuous, which was particular to the person doing it or the authority figure. And it was used to abuse people in the past, which is why we get a lot of abuse in, at least in certain religious settings. Christianity, Catholicism is really going through this right now in the news. There's been many cases of this. And it's not just to one religion, it happens to any place where there's kind of this kind of authority. Human carnality comes through and people take advantage of other people when they're not true to the faith, let's say. But it has caused a lot of problems. And so we want to just we're trying to get rid of the stickiness, this fixity that's allowing this arbitrariness to kind of come in. So these atheists are trying to give a full cancellation. It's not a sublation. We're doing a full cancellation. We're not preserving anything because we're trying to run away from this sensuousness. And this is what Frege was trying to do. The analytic philosophers were saying, okay, we're going to ignore all the continental philosophers, Hegel, and all this like weird stuff they're doing. Start from clear logic, and we're just going to rebuild things. And then we don't have any stickiness, none of this particularity. It's just pure logic, pure thought. Boom. Okay, then. What we're trying to get rid of, in its essence, with religion, is this concept of revelation. This is the principle of it, that the truth is revealed. It's not derived. It's derived from God, but God's revealing it to you, right? So what does revelation mean? It means the act of revealing or disclosing. Secondarily, it means to cause to appear, allow to be seen, lay open to view. So this word appear is kind of key in Hegel. Appearance has an immediacy to it. Our experience in the world is immediate. We're immediately taking it in as sense certainty. It's being revealed to us. We don't really you don't have to understand how a photon works to see color, you know? You don't have to understand the thoughts of the universal laws of the universe to experience it intuitively and immediately. It just appears to us. It's a revealing to us. And religion is saying, well, you know, we have these insights coming from a beyond, and you don't really need to know how it works. It just works. And no matter how sensuous you are, you know, there is a problem with sensuousness, whether you're Buddhist or Christian, or there's always this fixity we're trying to elevate ourselves from, but you have to do it through revelation. But the problem is that it's not justified. You can't justify it or think it through. You just have to take somebody's word for it, and that's where the abuse happens. So the opposite of this is the atheist saving grace. It's as atheists, it's our stability, our ability to find truth through axioms, axiomatic thinking, where it's consistent, rigorous, logical. So if you look at the definition here, it says, axiomatic thinking and axioms are pertaining to or of the nature of axiom, self-evident, obvious, a self-evident truth that requires no proof, a universally accepted principle or rule. So the first two sound a little bit odd because this self-evident obviousness and no proof is not how we normally think of axioms, but that kind of is what they are. You start with something that is so obvious that it doesn't need derivation. There's nothing before it. It's fundamental, and it's logically fundamental. How we normally think of an axiom is, in the last definition here, a universally accepted principle or rule. So you can keep repeating it in a consistent way, in a systematic way. Science is systematic. It doesn't have anything arbitrarily coming in and, you know, miracles and miraculously making things happen that are illogical or rational. So this is kind of how we like to think of it. But what is these other two definitions about self-evident, you know, revelation basically is problematic because it's leading us back to the thing we're resisting. But this is where an internal contradiction is starting to bud, and Hegel's going to pry this wide open to kind of show what real atheism is about. And he does that by becoming more atheist than atheist. He's not going to totally negate atheism because he's about sublation, about this integration and transcendence. He wants to acknowledge the truth that we're trying to approximate with abstract atheism. To get into it, I'm going to give some direct quotes to show that we're not making this up. This isn't some kind of random interpretation that we as atheists want to wishfully put upon the material. This is kind of Hegel saying it himself. So he's talking about axioms directly in the science of logic. And the science of logic, if you're just coming in now, is Hegel's linchpin. And it's the thing that nobody else has done and nobody else has even gotten close to doing. But he combined two things that atheists kind of love. We as atheists are really looking towards number one, logic, which is, it puts people to sleep. It's so dry and boring and lacking mystical and all the superstition. It's the one thing that we can just say is clear of any sensuousness. And it's dry and it doesn't have this weird life concept to it. But then Hegel does the second thing, and he combines it with the second most boring thing, which is science, the science of logic. Now, if you're a mystic or an artist, now you're really falling asleep. But to a logician, to an atheist that doesn't want any of that stuff, it's like the tour de force. It's the heaven of the atheists, or we as atheists want to revel in this. So I'm taking this from there. And he's saying the other sciences have, on the whole, discarded the correct method. That is, a sequence of definitions, axioms, theorems, and their proofs, and etc. So-called natural logic now has its own validity in the sciences and manages to get along without any special knowledge of the nature of thought itself. So he's basically saying the real method, as we know, is speculative thought, speculative philosophy. And it's like this presuppositionless kind of method. It's a method that's no method. And this is not what ordinary sciences are doing, what he calls finite sciences. He's talking about the infinite science in his system, right? But in terms of ordinary science, like contemporary science that we have today, he's saying that their method has these axioms and these theorems, which is not what he's calling the correct method. And they're not needing anything else to justify them, right? And he's pointing out something. He's saying there's something going on here that you're taking for granted. So to continue, he says, but the matter and content of these sciences is held to be completely independent of logic, and also has more appeal for sense, feeling, figurative conception, and practical interest of any kind. So what he's saying here is that real science, real logic, doesn't really appeal to the senses, the feeling, figure, conception, or any of these things. But this other way kind of has a little bit of that in it, even though it's kind of pretending to be real science. There's something going on here where they are appealing to an obviousness that we just sense with our immediate thought. So the second paragraph is him talking about axioms again, and he's hinting at a further problem. He's saying, we may add in this connection that Kant's assertion of the synthetic nature of the foundations of pure geometry is equally without any solid basis. He admits that several are really analytic, but only adduces one in support of his assertions that they are synthetic, namely the axiom that the straight line is the shortest line between 2 points. But here again, the question is not of a notion of straightness as such, but of a straight line. And this is already something spatial and intuitive. So he's saying that Kant, of course, is respected as this great philosopher because he separates these two worlds of the congeries and all this weird stuff, and he makes it a thing in itself, the noumenon, that we can't know. All we're ever doing is approximating it with our subjectivity, a subjective idealism, and our thinking can be flawed. So we need to constantly question ourselves in our interpretation of the world. So Kant really uses precise, rigorous analytical logic and synthetic logic to kind of unpack terms in a very rigorous way where we can catch our assumptions and our superstitions and all this kind of stuff. But now Hegel's catching him in that way. It's a nice irony. That's how dialectic works. And he's pointing out that even these fundamental geometric concepts of pure thought that we can't see in the world, right? So they seem super sensuous. They seem purely logical. And that's why Kant wants to use them as examples of how to think properly. Well, he's not really an atheist, right? But he's trying to point out how to think clearly. And atheists want to take that from him. But Hegel is saying, actually, you're making an assumption here. There's something here you're not justifying. And it's the fact that the concept of a line is sensuous, but we think that it's not because most people don't have a clear understanding of the distinction between the world of pure thought, of pure logic, and the sensuous world. So he's being a little bit religious here about his geometry because a line requires three-dimensional space or at least two-dimensional space. But in the true supersensuous world, in the non-sensuous world of pure logic, right, in the science where the science of logic is happening, the atheist heaven, there's no space, there's no time. It's spaceless and timeless. It's just pure conceptual, pure thought thinking self in the realm of pure thought as its native soil, right? So he's saying that straightness does belong in this world, but of a line is the sensuousness sneaking its way in and constantly catching that because you have to have incredibly precise thinking to grasp these dialectics without sneaking anything religious. This is what we want as atheists, right? We're this absolute total negation to get rid of religion entirely. That's what we're trying to do, is that thing right there. And Hegel's able to do this, but he's not doing it in an abstract negation. He's doing it in sublation. But you can see the power of this here. He's catching the master himself, Kant, in an ironic moment of being a hypocrite in his axioms, right? Now here's the Magnum Opus. This is the final nail in the coffin here for axiomatic thinking to Hegel. And it's coming towards the end of the science of logic. So these other paragraphs come towards the beginning. You can say, well, you know what, you're cherry picking, and it's his the early part of the system, and he develops it further on. But no, there's a whole part on the axiom in the section on the logic of cognition. It says axioms to take this opportunity of mentioning them belong to the same class. They are commonly but incorrectly taken as absolute firsts, as though in and for themselves they require no proof. So he's saying, of course, there's something directly wrong about the axioms. People take them as principles, as a starting point to build off of, right? And they don't really require any proof. So they're sort of taken as obvious. They're revealing. They reveal themselves as just self-justifying. Were this in fact the case, though, Hegel goes on, he says, they would be mere tautologies, as it is only in abstract identity that no difference is present, and therefore no mediation required. If, however, axioms are more than tautologies, they are propositions from some other science, since for the science they serve as axioms, they are meant to be presuppositions. So he's saying that the way a finite science is an abstract way of doing science, how it sneaks in these axioms as scientific is they're just borrowing them from a different science that has somehow justified them, or at least filling them out in some kind of way, when really they might not have been, because they're just taken as self-evident. To go on, he says, hence they are strictly speaking theorems, and theorems taken mostly from logic. The axioms of geometry or lemata of this kind, logical propositions, which moreover approximate to tautologies because they are only concerned with magnitude and therefore qualitative differences, are extinguished in them. The chief axiom, the purely quantitative syllogism, has been discussed above, because it's at the end of his logic, right? Axioms, therefore, considered in and for themselves, require proof as much as definitions and divisions. And the only reason they are not made into theorems is that, as relatively first for a certain standpoint, they are assumed as presuppositions. So now he's saying, in no uncertain terms, if you're going to be a real atheist, you're going to be a real scientist or a real philosopher, you can't take anything for granted. No presuppositions. He justifies literally everything in the science of logic. Even the beginning is justified. And so he's just pointing out that the sneakiness needs to end. There's an internal contradiction budding here that's making people who think they're doing real science into kind of hypocrites, at least logically. So now we're showing that we're not cherry picking here. Hegel's really unsettled by this. And he wants real sort of axiomatic thinking that's perfectly justified, which is no revelation, right? So we're thinking, okay, Hegel's really going against religion. Yes, okay, he's pointing out something wrong in abstract atheistic thinking, but we're working towards real atheistic thinking. He's being more atheist than atheist. Awesome. And that's technically true, right? So here's a graph of how to think about this now. Here's where we've arrived pictorially. Revelation has, self-evident God, omnipotence. Take the principles from God. There's nothing before God. God existed in itself, doesn't need any justification. It creates the world, and then we come from the world, and we're trying to understand things, and we just got to accept these revelations as eternally true. Don't question them. They just work. Where have we arrived at axiomatic thinking? Well, look, there's an unsettling, uncanny similarity going on here. Self-evident, principles, logic. We're just replacing God with logic, right? But look at this. There's still nothing before here. It's unjustified beginning. And then you go into your mind, spirit, as apprehension. So you immediately grasp these principles of the axioms. But then once you grasp them a little bit better, you can develop them and you can comprehend them. And so you get this kind of like comprehension spirit or state of mind. I put a sun here because it's just to highlight this is revelation. This axiomatic way of thinking is just repeating the thing we're resisting in religion. And you just have to accept these things kind of like as you accept God. They just work. They're so primal, you don't have to justify them. But that's kind of the same logic as God being just so obviously powerful and these notions in our text being so profound that you just accept them. So, of course, this is the kind of contradiction. And Hegel's saying that when you try and get rid of this problem, you do end up not with these sciences borrowing from other sciences in these unjustified kind of ways. But there's a science of sciences. If you're really a true logician, you're really truly atheistic and you're justifying everything without revelation, there is one science that is the science of all sciences. And he says in this quote, how much of the particular parts is requisite to constitute a particular branch of knowledge is so far indeterminate that the part, if it is to be something true, must be not an isolated member merely, but itself an organic whole. The entire field of philosophy, therefore, really forms a single science, but it may be also viewed as a total composed of several particular sciences. So he's just emphasizing here that they are connected. There's nothing unjustified here. And when you connect the science with all the other sciences, it kind of circles back on itself and completes itself. This is the right way to do atheistic science, not this kind of fake revelatory way, which is sneaking in logic as God, and it's an abstract, incomplete logic that we're making up because we think we're seeing reality or thinking reality truly fundamentally. But as we showed with Kant earlier, we might not be. And we got to stop this kind of stuff from going on if we're real philosophers. So it says, well, okay, then, if you can't really get rid of this revelationary component and you keep your sciences in this axiomatic way, then you're really doing some version of atheistic religion, which is contradictory, right? But you're just making logic your God. So here's a contradiction, right? You have to justify everything. But if you justify everything, you're still not really free yet. There's something else we as concrete atheists have to deal with. And we're going to be talking about it in this final paragraph. And this is sort of where, for me, trying to break out of ordinary consciousness for, the 3,000 hours that it took me to get out of this abstract way of thinking, this is one of the first quotes where it sunk in, this circle of reason, the science of sciences. And it goes like this. And a perception of this danger has in modern times led some to say that God's existence is not capable of proof, but must be immediately or intuitively apprehended. Reason, however, and even sound common sense give demonstration a meaning quite different from that of the understanding. The demonstration of reason no doubt starts from something which is not God. Okay, so we're getting super atheistic here. That's good for us as atheists in the atheistic mode. But he's saying that this intuitive, immediate understanding is not good enough for a spirit, for genuine reason. Remember, Hegel says what is actual is rational, what is rational is actual. So even when he's talking of God, it has to be a rational one. And we're trying to get away from this immediacy, this intuitive kind of revealing thinking. It says, but as it advances, it does not leave the starting point a mere unexplained fact, which is what it was. On the contrary, it exhibits that point as derivative and called into being, and then God is seen to be primary, truly immediate, and self-subsisting, with the means of derivation wrapped up and absorbed in himself. So you don't have to prove it, right? But Hegel says you do actually. Those who say, consider nature, and nature will lead you to God, you will find an absolute final cause, do not mean that God is something derivative. They mean that it is we who proceed to God himself from another. And in this way, God, through the consequence, is also the absolute ground of the initial step. The relation of the two things is reversed, and what came as a consequence being shown to be an antecedent, the original antecedent is reduced to a consequence. This is always the way, moreover, whenever reason demonstrates. So he's saying that if you start with the existentialists, right, nature, they just start reality with nature. There's nothing before it. He's saying that even if you start there as an antecedent, it fills itself out logically, and it kind of comes full circle if it's truly logical, and it has to be its own ground. If it's one science, one system, there can't be anything outside of it, because then you're relying on revelation, right? There's something that's not logical in a logical system. If there is one logic that incorporates and explains all things, you don't have all these other random revealed logics, these principles borrowed from other places, you know, whether it's a God or a different finite category of knowledge, it's not complete. So this real justified thinking, complete justified thinking, is this circle where the end, where you start as an axiom, as an antecedent, develops itself and becomes its own justification. So its result becomes its own explanation of how it got there in the first place. This is the kind of contradictory circular reasoning that Kant and Wittgenstein and Frege and all these other great, or Russell's paradox, Bertrand Russell, they tried to get away from this. That this is a problem with our thinking. This is not how the world works. The world's linear and all this kind of stuff. But of course, we know that Hegel says real philosophy is a little bit mystical in that way, where it actually is circular if you're really logical. If you're really atheistic and you really rely on logic, you have to do this, or else you're relying on revelation. And if you're trying to get that from nature, nature itself is unjustified. You're just saying that nature is your God again. It's just revealing itself to you. And some people are okay with that. But a real logician is going to say to themselves, you're right. If I'm not justifying my axioms, then I'm just doing the same kind of revelation thing. So luckily for us, Hegel does complete the circle in a much more satisfactory way for the atheist and for the theist, to be honest. It's kind of like fulfilling what they were trying to do. But this circle here is trying to show how you get an absolute when you do this. There's one absolute system of logic that completes itself. This is the alpha and the omega of atheism. The beginning is the end is the beginning. An axiom has to justify itself. And Hegel does a really tremendous way with dialectics, showing how to do this through his entire encyclopedia of the philosophical sciences. So notice he's saying it's the encyclopedia of the philosophical sciences and not the encyclopedia of the religious doctrines only. But of course, what Hegel's doing is a sublation, which is that we're not canceling everything in religion. This absolute is what religion is calling God. They beat abstract atheism by holding their logic more speculatively. So that's why the Bible, that's why the Quran, that's why all these other texts look contradictory and hypocritical, is because actually they're hitting on the true nature of reality in a genuinely wise sense. It's just that you have to put it in a system that is still logical and grounds itself, which is what they didn't do. But they grasped the need for a concrete thinking of logic that grounds itself. So they were just using a name, God, to do it in an indeterminate way, which is what Hegel doesn't really like. He's saying it needs to be determined. And this is what the atheist really wants. We can know this God in ourselves and think through it reasonably with logic. But it has to be this kind of complete logic, not the kind of fake kind of logic, which sneaks in things that can lead us astray. But it works good enough for now, right? So it's approximating, if you notice, all the domains of our current knowledge are kind of coming together. We have biophysics now. We have chemical, chemical physics too, I guess, or quantum chemistry, or, we're getting this pretty amazing picture that even everything can be framed in calculus and differential equations. But Hegel beat us to the punch. He did this logically 200 years ago. Maybe not in as depth as our finite sciences are, but he got the infinite science connected to the sciences of sciences in one universal logic, the atheist dream. So this is where we're going to finish. This is what absolute atheism is, and this is the circle of absolute atheism, the logic that we're searching for. And in a way, this is the only kind of God that an atheist, a true atheist, can believe in. This is the only kind of absolute that's not really revealing in an arbitrary sense, but has this kind of deeper satisfaction that even our own biases in logic, our own axioms can be justified. And as we covered in the previous sessions, if you want to find out how Hegel begins his system, because if it's always eternal, logic is always complete in itself, how do you begin it? That's a contradiction right there. You need a presupposition to start that system, or else you have an axiom. But Hegel, of course, brilliantly starts it by saying it's a godless beginning. You don't even assume God, right? That's an axiom, technically. So what you start with, the only thing you can start with as a genuinely, absolutely logical and truly rational philosopher is a presupposition that is no presupposition. The very canceling of presupposition is the presupposition that results in the true beginning, the pure being, pure indeterminacy, which we know is the ineffable speaking itself in pure form, that becomes its own content logically. And you can get into those sessions if you go back there. But I hope as an atheist, or as our atheistic selves, we've sublated this moment now. We've seen the truth in the atheistic moment, that we want to preserve the determinate nature of truth, and we want to do it logically and completely. But we're preserving the sort of absolute, the God, the concrete totality of religion. And we're trying to put them together and say, how do you have this determinate concrete totality? That's not just revelation. It's something that we can know and justify completely. And this is the best of both worlds mixed together, right? And I think if we didn't do a good job sublating, please tell us what we're missing, because this is some pretty new stuff, I would say, and can kind of harmonize these worlds, what they were missing and what they got right. So hopefully we got this moment on the circle of reason. And if you want to participate in the peaceful revolution and be more practical and say, yeah, this is part of the answer, or at least a good start to something we're not gonna, follow and then repeat the past in some way, then you can go to the Hegelians who want to change the world Facebook group. Ask your questions. It's okay to negate, because the first negation is part of sublation. But you can also go and take the wisdom quiz and check to see how good are you at this logic, this axiomatic thinking that actually is self-grounding. It has to be self-grounding. We'll go through that with you. There's a synchronicity document that if you're already good at sublation, this kind of logic, then you can go to all the other philosophies in the world and just show where their limit was, where it was holding them apart from this universal logic, and start sublating all the religions into this self-grounding logic that is Hegel's science of logic. If you're really confident, you can start doing some on-the-ground activism, some peaceful activism, where you can get into the actual industries where these new technologies are being developed, like CRISPR, and start implementing this new wisdom, this concrete kind of thinking that makes sure we use these technologies in a holistic way and in this kind of wise way, complete way. Then there's the 16 Paths of Parmenides, which talks about when you're going to try and convince other people, there's an interpersonal dynamic where, there's 18,000 wrong ways to do it, or painful ways. And there's one sublative way, which idealizes the interaction and gets the point across. And maybe a beautiful Platonic dialogue, or a Socratic dialogue, where both people are participating in a meaningful way. And it's enjoyable and it's fun. Then the next one is, well, where do we need to sublate? Where's the biggest sublations that need to happen? How much sublation is needed in the world? We're going to use this universal survey of wisdom to figure out where people's truths are, where their axioms are, whether it's in the God world, the supersensuous world, or in math or physics or finite science. I have a live feed where if you want to watch or send people for me to sublate and kind of watch it maybe as a spectator sport, or, make philosophy into its universal mode. It's supposed to be the big kahuna. And that's why we're lacking wisdom in the world. So I'm doing my part to try and do this in a practical way. And then we're going to also try and turn this into an ideal state, a new world spirit. And the stereotype of Hegel's state is not this totalitarian thing. There's actually a lot of self-determination. The individual is protected by a properly rational state. So if you want to work on that, that's another practical thing we need to do. And there's a universal form of reason that you can use called the notion, which explains how to go about science in this kind of speculative way. So tomorrow, what we're going to talk about is a return to this absolute, this concrete God, this concrete way of doing logic that actually sublates you too. So it's going to get pretty profound, but if we really grasp this, there's something that is incredibly empowering. And whether you're an atheist or a theist, we're sublating both modes, right? So this is where we're going to start getting people coming together and truly being genuinely speculative, ideal philosophers that are going to usher in this new wisdom and a new higher spirit. So thank you. I hope you enjoyed. If you want to join me in some discussions, feel free. And until then, keep sublating and stay free.